So last week we kind of laid the groundwork for what is the great enemy to our souls, right? This problem of hurry. And this week I want to look at what is one of the solutions to this problem. The difficulty is that for most of us, this solution is going to probably create a whole new set of problems. It's one of those things where it's like, oh man, that sounds really, really good. I just don't know if I can do that, right? This is going to be one of those. That sounds like a really, really healthy way for me to approach my life from here on out, but man, I just don't know if I can pull it off. So the solution is likely to create more problems for us. We're going to look at some passages of Scripture that talk about the subject of the Sabbath. Okay, we're going to talk about the Sabbath, and the Sabbath as a remedy that God has built into the infrastructure of our being to help us with this problem of hurry, to help us with the problem of anxiety, to help us with so many of the problems that we experience in the world. If we will listen to God's design and framework for the rhythm by which we ought to be living our lives. Now, we're going to read multiple passages of Scripture that all deal with the same subject, and it's going to sound like the Scriptures are just sort of reiterations of ones we have already read, and I hope that's okay. How many of you know sometimes we're a little slow? Right? Anybody else here? Like, I'm slow. I told you last week, I mean, if there's an area of great difficulty, for me, it is this problem of hurry. It is this problem of rushing around, of trying to go after more, right? We've talked multiple times about the problem of more. And so if we could just, I hope, like, open our hearts, open our spirits to what God is speaking to us with regard to Sabbath. Again, this is going to be hard, right? The idea of it, I think we'll all probably agree how wonderful it sounds. The question is whether or not we're going to be willing to engage on actually beginning to practice this. So I want to start right at the beginning. Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. This, of course, is the creation account. Unfortunately, Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3 are really kind of, if the chapters were more properly divided, it really should be the end of chapter 1. You'll find a lot of people talking about how chapter 2 really begins in verse 4. So we have this creation account in Genesis chapter 1, right in the beginning. And for us, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, here's how it reads. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. Right? You might remember that there is in chapter 1 a description of how God created the universe, the heavens, the earth, and everything that is in it. Right? Over the sequence of these 6 days in which God created the world. So on the 7th day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. So we're told here that following the creation of the world, that God rested. What we often hear is that God did like we do when we have reached the point of exhaustion, because we go until we can't go anymore. And then we slough ourselves on the couch, we throw ourselves on the bed, exhausted from all of the labor and the toil, and we rest, sort of because we're forced into it by that point. And so we hear that, but that's not exactly what's going on. When it says God rested from his labor, it's not that God breathed a huge sigh of relief. You know, like, I am glad that's over. What a week. How many of you said, what a week before? Right? You get home, it's like, oh, what a day. What it means when it says that he rested is he ceased. That's it. He ceased. He stopped. He On the seventh day, he neither created another thing, nor did he go and manage what he had produced already, so that it might perhaps produce a better yield. No, he ceased, he stopped. Sabbath in this form is a verb. We think of Sabbath as, Sunday, the holy day, right? That's the Sabbath. But Sabbath, as it is expressed here, it's a verb. This is something you do. It's something that God did. He ceased, he stopped from his labor. We're told here that God blessed the Sabbath day. Right? So in this ceasing from his labor, he then pronounces a blessing on that day. What he's essentially doing, if you, again, read through the pattern of how God created the world, you'll find a refrain at the conclusion of his work each day, right? Some of you are familiar with it. Right? God did such and such, and then he observed what he had made, and he called it what? Good. Right? So God spoke light into existence. And God said the light is good. And that refrain repeats itself day after day after day as God creates the universe. So in God, in pronouncing the blessing on the seventh day, what he is essentially doing is he is putting that day at a place of equality with the other days. All those days of production, all those days that God did something good, so it is that this day in which he has ceased all production, it is also good. It wasn't inferior to the day when God spoke light into existence, or when God called the waters together to form dry land, or in something perhaps like time-lapse fashion, he caused the earth to bring forth every kind of plant and tree. Or even when he breathed the breath of life into the first human being. God blessed the Sabbath day. He blessed it. Not only did he bless it, but God declared the Sabbath day to be holy, right? That is, the Sabbath day, while it is good just like the other 6 days of the week, the Sabbath isn't to look like the other days. This is not to be one of 7 days that is like all the other days. No, this is a holy day, that it is distinct, it is separate, it is other than the other 6 days. It is a day, we are told, where the normal occupation of labor and toil is foregone, and what remains is the time and space for every person to rest, to worship, and to delight with others in God's good creation. The idea is that there's nothing more to do. There's nothing more to make. There's nothing more to go after. It is time to rest. It is time to stop. It is time to delight in what already is. The Sabbath is not a day for us to further our ambitions or to make up for failed quotas, right? How many of you have thought of that day off as, well, this is my buffer day, right? I didn't get everything done that I needed to get done over the course of the week. Thank goodness I have this buffer day kind of built in. So now the overflow of my produce, the overflow of my work that I haven't yet accomplished, I can get it done so I can start the week off nice and fresh. How many of you ever looked at the day off like that, or the Sabbath day, right? I mean, who wants to go to work on Monday and feel like you're already behind the 8 ball because you didn't get everything done that you needed to get done last week? And so we have in our minds this idea that, I'm going to be far better off, I'm going to be far more productive, I'm going to be far more emotionally healthy if I can start the week off right. How do I start the week off right? Well, I make sure I got all my work done from the week before. We use the day to make a little extra, but God declared the day holy. He declared the Sabbath day holy. We cannot lose sight of that fact that God blessed this day and God made it holy. He says, treat this day differently from all the other 6 days. All right, now, so that sort of sets up the framework of how Sabbath is built into creation, right? And many of you know, when we kick against the way in which God has created the world and the way God has created us, we are moving against the grain, right? When you operate against the way God has designed for us to work and for things to work, I mean, you can do it, but boy, does it come with great, great cost to you and me when we do that, right? Because we're going against the grain. Instead of moving with God's good creation, moving with God's good intent and design for our lives, we're moving against it. In Exodus chapter 20, we see the Sabbath now relayed to us in the form of a command. Okay, Exodus 20 contains the 10 commandments. How many of you know it's Sabbath? Remembering the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. I mean, we're talking about moral code here. Okay? So, like, let's not just fluff it off as sort of some, maybe I'll do it, maybe I won't. Like, let's just realize what it is exactly that we're dealing with here. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, you, your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So this account here, this command is grounded in that creation narrative that we already read, right? That is that the Lord blessed this day. He ceased from his creative work, and he blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. What I want for us to know is two things when it comes to the Sabbath. And that is that the Sabbath is a command and it's a gift. The Sabbath is a command and it's a gift. And we need to hold, when we're talking about something like this, as people that know, like we're not living under the demands of some imperial law, right, that's meant to like create unnecessary burdens in our lives. In fact, if that were the case, this would be way out of place for all of the stuff that we're talking about. Right? Jesus' invitation was, hey, come to me. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, all of you who have been beat up by the world and everything around you. Come to me and I will give you rest. Come, take my yoke upon you, for my burden is easy and my yoke is light, right? Or my yoke is easy and my burden is light, right? So Jesus, he makes this invitation to us. And so when we talk about the Sabbath, while I don't want us to lose the significance of what we are commanded to do, even within the framework of the 10 Commandments, let's not forget the very, very important fact that the Sabbath is also a gift. Now, the 10 Commandments were given in the context of the Hebrew people coming out of bondage and slavery in Egypt, right? And now here they are, encountering God, and God is establishing a covenant with them, a covenant where he will be their God and they will be his people. And so the 10 Commandments are not just an alternative way that some alternative God has determined, well, this is how you're going to serve me if I'm going to be your God. But rather, it's a covenant that is established between God and those who would be the people of God. And what this covenant does, while we might look at it kind of simply as a command, what it really represents for the nation of Israel is a regime change. Back in verse 2 of Exodus chapter 20, we read sort of the preamble of the 10 Commandments, which read like this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Right before God ever even gets into the things that he is commanding for his people to do and to live by, he gives them this preamble, this context that's going to make sense of these commands that he is now declaring for them. I am the Lord your God. I am the God who is entering into this covenant with you. I am the one that brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That is, a few moments ago, you all were living under an imperial regime, right, that treated you as subhuman, that treated you as slaves. For hundreds of years, forced labor and slavery upon you. You didn't have your own personal liberty and freedom. Neither did you have the right to worship the one true God, right? But hey, there's a regime change here that's taking place. Israel is being onboarded to a whole new way of life, right? All they knew was a life of slavery. All they knew was a life of oppression and of obeying taskmasters that were constantly demanding more and more, exacting every little bit of labor value out of every single one of those people, right? That's the life that they had known. And they had lived their lives as slaves, but now they were being brought out of that life. I am the Lord that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so this covenant that God is establishing with them, it marked a regime change, right? No longer are you living under that regime. You are now coming under a new regime. And what's the difference? Well, when you think about what it was like to live in Egypt as slaves, you lived under the kingship, really the godship of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, particularly, could never be appeased. Pharaoh would never be satisfied. Pharaoh would never utter to those who were providing the labor for his society, he would never say to them, I want you every week to take a day of rest. No, there was no such thing as a Sabbath. There was no such thing as stopping. It was just always more, more, more. As much labor as a person could possibly produce, they were expected to give. See, as slaves, the Hebrews were regarded as something less than human, and so they could be exploited for the full capacity of their labor value. This meant no rest, because Egypt always had something more to build. They always had something more to do. The economic advancement that resulted from this unceasing labor that was being provided by this massive group of slaves, it required even more labor to then sustain it, right? When more grain than was needed was harvested, well, then store cities had to be built in order to contain it. And so you see, with the advancement and the progress of a society like Egypt, more and more and more was exacted from those who could provide for it. And the demands of Pharaoh, like all the ancient gods, had no limits. There was no end. There was no, well, when we hit this mark, then we're done. There was no such thing as that, right? There was always this quest for more and bigger and better. And so where Egypt demanded more, right, that was the old regime change that they lived under. And where Egypt demanded more, God commended rest. What a difference in the life that God was calling the nation of Israel to. Right? It's not that Sabbath is to be a burden, right? Yes, Sabbath is commanded, but Sabbath is also a gift. God sets himself apart from Pharaoh. He sets himself apart from every other ancient god. And he sets himself apart from the commercial and consumeristic economic system of the land of Egypt. What he says is the Sabbath is a Sabbath to God. To God. The seventh day is a Sabbath to God. Pharaoh required more. Egypt required more goods. The gods required more sacrifices, but God called for a day of ceasing, where everything stopped. Exodus chapter 34, many of you have seen the movie. You know that God was establishing this covenant with his nation, but Moses took too long on the mountain. The people revolted. They made this golden calf. They began worshiping this God, and Moses came down and freaked out and broke the tablets of stone, right? And so we get to Exodus 34, and we hear sort of a reissuing of the commandments here. And again, the Sabbath is listed among them. Exodus chapter 34, verse 21. 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. So here we have the reestablishment of the covenant. What I find really interesting about the way that the Sabbath commandment is framed here, perhaps you caught it, is that Sabbath is required and needed, especially when it would seem that we could least afford to observe it. Do you notice that? 6 days shall you work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. Why did they put that in there? I mean, that wasn't part of the framework as it was given to us in Exodus chapter 20. Why this additional commentary, right? Why go beyond just the simple notion that the seventh day is a holy day, it is a special day, it is a day to be treated like others? Why this little extra of even in the season of plowing and the season of harvesting, you are to observe it? Well, I'd ask us, when do you suppose it is most difficult for us to observe the Sabbath? Like, why is observing the Sabbath as we ought to, why is that such a difficult thing for us? Why is that so hard? Why does that create so many logistical problems for our lives? Well, it's because we're too busy, right? Isn't that it? I mean, we're too busy. We have too much to do. Right? There's always something more to buy. There's always another place to go. There's always another show to watch. There's always another thing that can occupy our time that is outside the scope of things like rest and worship and simple being with others. I imagine some of us have at times thought in our own hearts, perhaps even shared with another person, that we'd like to get to the place where we can actually observe the Sabbath as we'd like to, but right now I'm in a season of my life where I'm just too busy to do it. Like, it's impossible, right? But once I get through this season, once I move beyond this place where it is impossible, then I will do it. And I think the flavor of the way this commandment is given to us here in Exodus 34, it tells us something to the effect of, hey, when you're at your busiest, when you feel like you are most unable to observe the Sabbath, guess what? That's when you need it the most. That's when you really ought to be pressing into stopping, ceasing. In the agricultural cycle, of course, the heavy loads were on the front end and the back end, right? Plowing and planting had to be done within a certain time frame. Same thing with harvesting. The question that the Israelite might have faced when it came to this agricultural lifestyle, the question that a person or a family might have to ask themselves is, well, do I limit my field size to the size that I can accommodate in the planting and harvesting season while maintaining my responsibility to observe the Sabbath as I ought to, right? So should I actually limit what it is that I grow so that it fits within my human limitations, my ability both to plow and to plant and also to harvest? So should I do that, or, right, here's the question, should I do that, or do I expand? I mean, I've got more land, right? I can make the field larger, and if I do that, if I expand, I can maximize the resources that are available to me. You have to imagine, like after year one, right? People kind of, they go into the harvesting season, right? And they harvest and are able to provide for their families. You can imagine it must have, like, some people must have had the entrepreneurial idea. You know, if I just expanded this thing by like 20%, then, well, next year not only would I be able to provide for my family, but then I'd have some extra, right? And I could take that extra to the market, and I can trade it for other things. I know it's hard for us to sometimes connect with ancient peoples and the kinds of lives that they live, but can you see the analogy of how in their maximizing what resources were available to them, we do oftentimes exactly the same thing? Why is it that we're so busy? Why is it that we're so full? It's because we've maximized ourselves. We've pushed ourselves beyond what are our proper limits, have gone beyond this thing called margin because it feels wasteful not to. Right? You can imagine the farmer just sort of being tempted there as he's kind of looking out over the field that he has planted and all of the unused ground that is also part of his property, thinking, man, what a waste. How can with just a little more effort, I'll probably have to work a little longer, I'll have to work a little harder. Chances are labor is going to creep into the Sabbath, but only during the plowing and planting season, only during the harvest season, like all in between, the land, everything's just kind of growing, right? Do you see? And so God, what he says, no. Don't give in to that temptation. Don't fall for that trap. Don't listen to that lie. This idea that the resources that you have available to you, to let them go unused is somehow wasteful, when it actually contradicts and opposes the law of Sabbath in our lives. One more, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 to 15. Be careful to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or donkey, any of your livestock, or the resident alien who lives within your city gates, so that your male and female slaves may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And that is why the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Here he says, be careful, right? Now, again, we're fast forwarding here. And Moses, now here in the book of Deuteronomy, is reminding the people to be careful, to remember the Sabbath. Why did they need to be careful? Well, I think part of what he is trying to inspire them with in their understanding of the Sabbath is that they need to approach the Sabbath with anticipation. That is, they need to plan for it. I'll tell you, Sabbath is never going to happen in our lives if we just expect it to happen in our lives. Sabbath has to be planned for. Sabbath has to be prepared for. He said, be careful. That is, treat the Sabbath fully with care, right? That's what it means to be careful. It's not, watch out or God's going to, send down lightning bolts because you've disobeyed, you've dishonored his command. That's not, the idea isn't to inspire fear in us. That's not what be careful means. It means be careful. Like, you need to take care to remember the Sabbath. Remember that you were a slave, he says. Now, slavery requires endless toil, and they're being reminded, you have come out of that, so don't go back into it. Why is Moses urging the people to be careful? Because he knows the tendency of people to revert back to where they came from. He's saying, you were slaves. Don't go back to being slaves again. All this time, the nation of Israel had been wandering in the wilderness, and God had been miraculously providing for them the food that they were eating. And Sabbath amounted to, on the day before the Sabbath, you go out and you collect twice as much as your family needs so that you have enough food for that day and also for the day where you can't go out and gather food, right? Because it's the Sabbath. So for 40 years, the people had been living and observing the Sabbath in this pretty simple way. But here's what's about to happen. Now the people, they're going to go into the promised land. And you know what's going to happen in the promised land? Stuff's going to grow. In fact, stuff's going to grow like crazy. Right? It is described as the land flowing with milk and honey. It's going to feel like it requires barely any effort. Like God's blessing is going to be on his people to the extent that they are going to grow in their prosperity. And I think Moses is able to envision a time when the people have grown so prosperous, they'll be tempted to forget. They'll be tempted to forget. And so Moses says, be careful to remember the Sabbath. A lot of times it's easy for us to remember when we're facing tremendous amounts of adversity. In those moments, it's easy for us, or it's easier for us to press into God, into God's presence, and to rely and trust in him because there's nothing else for us to rely and trust in. But, what about for these people, when the barns are full? In fact, the barns aren't only full, but they have to build other barns in order to accommodate all of the extra that they have grown this year. What happens when you and I, when our sort of analogous barns are full? Have we then forgotten that our trust and our faith and our hope is to remain in God and not in what we have? See, the Sabbath is intended to allow us to remain free, to not revert back to a life of slavery. And I know, we're sitting here thinking, well, we're not slaves, right? And you might think that you're free from the rule of others, like outside that annoying boss that you have to work for, and maybe a few other obligations. We think we're free from the rule of others, but are we actually free from our own insatiable desires? Have the desires of my heart, have the desires of your heart grown to the point where that has become the occupying forces in our lives that is causing us to continue to labor and toil in our search and our quest for more? And in essence, we have become slaves to that. Sabbath allows us to remain free because Sabbath breaks the cycle of more. And it gives us the opportunity to delight in what already is. That's what Sabbath has to do with the out-of-control desires that we are often prone to experiencing. Sabbath gives you the time and the space to enjoy what I already have. Sabbath not only helps me to remain free from the taskmaster of my own selfish desires, but guess what? Sabbath also helps me to avoid becoming a taskmaster myself. You hear in this command that Moses gives, right? Neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male servant or female servant, nor your livestock, right? Like that everything comes to rest. Every single person, every single beast of burden, and the land itself comes to rest on the Sabbath. Sabbath not only breaks the cycle of bondage and slavery in my own personal life, but it helps me avoid becoming a taskmaster myself. When you live in an economic system like we live in, an economic system like what Egypt was, where desire is not only without limits, but the very system is designed to cultivate and provoke more desire in you, right? That's the system that you and I live in. That's why when you watch TV, there are commercials inviting you to buy something. That's why when you scroll the internet, right, on the sides there, advertisements telling you you're not happy enough because you don't have this thing yet. Right? What is it doing? It's provoking, it's cultivating more desire in us. It's stirring up desire. Our economic system depends on it. It depends on us going out and buying stuff. It depends on the exchange of goods and services in order for the, and I use this term loosely, the progress and advancement of our society to continue to be propelled forward. But what happens when we participate in that system, we become, minimally, we become unwilling participants in the extortion of other people. There's no way around it. It's not something we like to think that we are participating in. But there's no way we get to have all that we have and all that we enjoy without somewhere along the line, whether you see it or not, somebody is being exploited. Like the Hebrews were being exploited in Egypt for the value of their labor and toil. So in our world today, there continues this system of exploitation where the masses provide for the privileged. And so what does Sabbath do? Well, Sabbath, it provides you and me an opportunity to avoid, to break the cycle to some degree. To say, I'm not going to buy another thing. I'm not going to participate as a consumer anymore for 24 hours. The system of consumption, anxiety, and scarcity that we live in, it requires exploitation. One of the questions I have to ask myself, I think that we all ought to ask ourselves, is, am I in the pattern and rhythms of my life? Am I requiring others to work for me when they ought not to be working? I've shared this before because I mean it's just it's a sort of low-hanging fruit example, but like should a follower of Jesus, should a Christian go out to a restaurant to eat after church? Right? I mean I know like everybody's waiting, right, for the church service to get over so they can beat the other church, right? So they don't have to wait. Right? I know that it's built into our culture. It's customary, right, for lots of people to go out to eat. But just think about it. Ought we to? If I go to a restaurant, if a bunch of us go to a restaurant, if society at large is all going to restaurants, what are we doing? Well, we are essentially requiring other people to work, right? To work for us. I'm not saying don't do it. I mean, I might be saying don't do it, but I'm not saying don't do it. But it's something we got to think about. If I treat today like any other day, and I kind of go off to the store and some retail environment, and, do my shopping. perhaps not only am I robbing myself, what I'm doing is I'm doing the business of my life, right? Maybe something that I should have taken care of one of the other 6 days, but I'm in fact using the overflow of this day instead of doing stuff like worship and relaxation and things that nurture and fill and feed my soul. I'm working, I'm toiling, but not only that, I'm also requiring others to work for me. Again, I'm not saying don't go to a store, but I might be saying don't go to a store. I can do this from home. Like if I spend the afternoon just kind of scrolling through things on Amazon, like allowing my desires for more to just keep being fed and nurtured and fostered, so that I'm still participating in consumeristic activities. Am I being, again, minimally an unwilling participant in a system that is making it impossible for others to Sabbath? How many of you are annoyed? I know a lot of you are annoyed sometimes. It's like kids' sports get scheduled, on a Sunday at all. But Sunday morning, especially, when there's lots of people that want to go to worship, and now they are thrust into this decision of, do I let my kids participate in this activity, or do I pull them out because it competes with another value that we have? Like, it stinks that we even have to face a choice like that, but we do. And a lot of times, let's be honest, we surrender to FOMO, right? I mean, if I don't let my 8-year-old go to baseball practice on Sunday morning, then he's not going to get a scholarship and, or become a professional baseball player, right? Like, we have this weird idea that we're going to miss out on something if we don't give into what culture is demanding from us. So I love, and I close with this. I love this filter that John Mark Comer encourages us to consider when we're thinking about, what am I doing with this day? And that is just simply asking ourselves this question: is this rest or worship? Is this providing rest? Is this providing nourishing life to my soul? Is my participation in whatever this thing is this providing me space for rest? Is it providing me opportunity to worship, right? Because those are two major components. A third is just being with others, being with other people, right? Celebrating what already is instead of trying to advance our ambitions for more. What if you could imagine with me for a second, what if there was nowhere for any of us to go out to eat? What if there literally was you could not go to a restaurant? It was 9 o'clock in Sanford on any night of the week. It's save for Applebee's, right? There is nowhere to go, right? What if the whole there's nowhere to go out to eat? What if Lowe's and Walmart and the grocery stores and every other kind of retail store was closed? You could not go shopping at any of those places. What if the internet shut down? What if your email didn't work? What if you could neither post nor scroll through social media? Imagine all of that stuff were true. Now, would our families be more healthy or less? Would our neighborhoods feel more tight-knit and alive? Would we be as lonely as individuals? Would we find ourselves competing less with and exploiting our neighbors? Now, I know we're never going to see that kind of vision legislated, right? That's not going to happen. A bunch of you are going to be like, I remember the days of the blue laws. We need the blue laws back, right? That's not, that'd be great, okay. But that's not going to happen, right? You can't legislate this kind of scenario. And so the question for you and I to wrestle with individually and as a spiritual community is, what does it look like for you and me to participate in a way that anticipates and fulfills this beautiful vision, right? Because the Sabbath, remember, it is not only a command, it is a gift. So let me close with the words of Jesus. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for Sabbath. It's not that God put this thing into place because it was a way in which we could fulfill or satisfy or appease the demand of some God. He gave it to us as a gift. And it's a gift that we so often and in so many ways just leave on the table. But we've got to bring it back. Amen.